The wind howled through the skeletal cottonwoods like a restless spirit rattling the shutters of Widow Malone's cabin with a persistence that bordered on spite. Snowflakes pale as forgotten promises settled on the frozen laundry she hung. Anyway, knowing full well they'd stiffen into icy ghosts before morning. Her hands, raw and split at the seams, fought with the clothespins. Each snap of the wood sounded like a secret being sealed away. Above the sky was a dull, pewter plate, the kind of light that made you squint but offered no warmth. Inside, the girls were silent. Clara, the eldest at 12, had learned early how to keep her mouth shut. She perched by the stove, her threadbare socks revealing bony ankles, her spine rigid with the unspoken burden of her mother's struggles. Little Ellie, barely 7, scribbled on the pantry door, with a lump of charcoal, a lopsided figure with too many teeth and eyes that followed you. Widow Malone let it slide. Paper was scarce, and Ellie hadn't spoken a word since the fever took her voice last winter. The fire crackled, spitting embers like a gambler tossing dice. Malone ignored it. She had a rhythm, pin, breathe, repeat. Then she saw him. No mistaking a stranger in a town like Bitter Creek. He was a mountain of a man, shoulders straining against a coat, held together by stubbornness, and Patches hauling a splintered cart with the grim determination of someone who'd already lost everything but his pride. A 3-legged mutt hobbled beside him, loyal as sin. The cart's contents, a dented coffee pot and a trunk with one hinge hanging by a prayer. He moved like a man walking to his own funeral. Malone averted her gaze before their eyes could meet. In Bitter Creek, eye contact was an invitation, and invitations got women like her killed. She retreated inside the warmth, hitting her cheeks like a slap. Clara's eyes flicked up. Ellie kept drawing. "Someone out there," Clara murmured. Malone nodded. "Just driftwood." They knew better than to ask more. Dawn came, and the man was still there, camped behind the saloon, snow crusted in his beard like sugar on hardtack. The dog shivered against his boots. Not a soul offered shelter. Not the barkeep, not the so-called reverend, and certainly not Sheriff Holloway. By sundown, the dog's whines cut through the wind. Malone watched from her window, hands busy with darning a sock she'd already mended twice. Her breath fogged the glass. Clara materialized behind her, quiet as a shadow. "You said once," the girl whispered, "that mercy ain't gotta be loud to count." Malone's needle hesitated. That night after the lanterns dimmed, Clara and Ellie crept out barefoot in the snow. They left a tin of beans and Ellie's frayed blue ribbon by the man's cart. The dog licked Ellie's fingers. She smiled first time in a year. Back inside, Malone pretended not to notice the missing ribbon, or the way Clara's shoulders looked lighter, like she'd finally set down a weight she'd been carrying too long. The wind kept howling, but for once it didn't sound quite so lonely. Ellie tucked the blue ribbon around the dog's neck, her fingers lingering in its matted fur. The man Beau didn't stir, but the dog licked her wrist, its tail thumping once in the snow. By dawn, the ribbon and beans were gone. Clara found her mother staring at the empty tin on the porch. "You fed him," Malone said, her voice worn thin as old flour sacks. Clara lifted her chin. "He worked for it, fixed the fence, didn't he?" Malone's hands clenched. In Bitter Creek, charity was a debt, and debts always came due. 3 days later, Sheriff Holloway cornered her outside the Mercantile, his breath reeking of rye. "That drifter's been asking about the old Clayton mine." He spat tobacco near her boot. "Men like him dig up trouble. Best keep your girls away." Malone kept her eyes on his silver star, tarnished at the edges. "Ain't my business where he goes?" The sheriff's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's my business, widow." That evening, Beau appeared at the woodpile with a fresh gash across his knuckles. Malone tossed him a rag without a word. He caught it, and for the first time spoke. "Found a vein of quartz west of here. Could split it 50-50. She froze. The Clayton mine had collapsed 10 years back, taking her husband and 6 other men with it. "That's fool's gold," she snapped. Literally. But Clara was listening, her eyes alight with something dangerous hope. The next morning, Malone woke to the sound of axes. Bo and Clara were clearing the collapsed shed, the 3-legged dog barking at splinters. Ellie danced around them, her silent laughter written in the frost. Malone's chest tightened. She'd seen that look before on her husband's face the day he'd left for the mine. Then the sheriff rode up with 2 deputies. "Heard you're prospecting on Clayton land," he drawled. Bo straightened his shovel like a rifle at rest. "Public land." Holloway's hand hovered near his Colt. "Funny. County records say different." Malone stepped between them, her voice steel. "You got a paper, show it. Otherwise you're trespassing." The standoff stretched until Holloway tipped his hat, smirking. "Winter's long widow. Hope your charity holds out." That night, Malone found Bo sharpening a pickaxe by moonlight. "You're putting ideas in my girl's head," she accused. He tested the edge with his thumb. "Ain't my ideas, just the truth. That quartz runs deep." She wanted to hate him. But Ellie tugged her sleeve, pressing a drawing into her hand, a stick figure family, with a tall man, a dog, and a cabin with smoke curling like a question mark. Outside, the wind moaned through the canyon. Somewhere, a wolf howled. Or maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe it was something waking up. Malone watched the flames lick at Ellie's charcoal drawing until it curled into black ash. That night, Mrs. Pritchard from the general store came by, her knuckles rapping the door like a judge's gavel. She thrust a jar of molasses into Malone's hands, too sweet, too expensive a bribe wrapped in concern. "Folks say that drifter's got Clayton blood on his hands," she hissed. "You really want to risk your girls for a man who can't even look you in the eye?" Malone's fingers whitened around the jar. "Ain't your concern, Martha?" The older woman's lips thinned. "It is when my nephew's the sheriff." The next morning, Malone found Bo skinning a rabbit by the woodpile, his knife moving with quiet precision. The 3-legged dog gnawed at the offal. Clara stood nearby, her arms crossed like she was guarding him. "They say you knew my husband," Malone said bluntly. Bo's knife stilled. "Worked the same shift down Clayton. He shared his lunch with me once." He didn't offer more, but the way his shoulders tensed told Malone everything guilt was a heavy thing to carry alone. That afternoon, Sheriff Holloway and 2 deputies rode up, just as Bo was repairing the porch steps. The lawman dismounted, spurs jingling like a rattlesnake's warning. "Heard you've been asking about the mine collapse," he said, thumb hooked in his belt near his revolver. Bo kept hammering. "Public record," Holloway kicked the new step, testing it. "Funny thing, records from that day went missing. Almost like someone didn't want folks knowing about the faulty beams my uncle ordered." Malone's breath caught. The sheriff's family had owned the mining company. Clara suddenly darted forward, clutching a yellowed newspaper clipping. "Pa kept this." Her voice shook. "Says right here, negligence suspected." Holloway's face darkened. He reached for it, but Bo stood blocking him with a quiet, terrifying solidity. The dog growled. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the sheriff spat. "Winter's long, widow. Hope your new man's good at digging graves." As they rode off, Ellie tugged Malone's sleeve. In her palm lay a perfect quartz crystal, the kind only found deep in Clayton's veins. That night, Malone didn't burn the new drawing Ellie left on her pillow. It showed 4 stick figures standing shoulder to shoulder, a 3-legged dog, and a sheriff's star cracked down the middle. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of dynamite blasting Bo clearing the mine entrance under cover of darkness. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder, or maybe justice. Malone poured 2 cups of coffee and waited by the window. The snow kept falling, but for the first time in years, it felt like something was growing underneath. Malone set the molasses biscuits between them, the tin scraping against the rough table. The quiet wasn't empty. It was the kind that sits easy between folks who've earned each other's silence. Beau's fingers, scarred and knotted, traced the rim of his coffee cup. "You always mend fences before they break," Malone observed. He glanced at the window where dawn painted the snow in shades of blue. "Broken things don't wait for permission to hurt somebody." Clara leaned forward, her braid slipping over her shoulder. "Where'd you learn to stitch like that?" Beau's thumb stilled on his mug. "Ma was a seamstress. Taught me before." The dog whined softly, pressing its muzzle against his knee. Ellie slid a drawing across the table, a woman with kind eyes holding a needle, a boy at her feet. Beau exhaled sharply, then nodded. "Yeah, like that." 3 days later, Malone found Beau at the edge of her property digging post holes in ground frozen solid as a banker's heart. His breath came in white puffs, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold. She thrust a steaming mug into his hands. "You'll kill yourself before spring." He drank deep the heat, making his cracked lips bleed. "Better than letting the past kill you slow." The words hung between them sharp as the pickaxe buried in the dirt. That Sunday, the church whispers followed Malone like a pack of coyotes. Mrs. Holloway accidentally spilled cider on Ellie's dress. The baker's son tripped Clara in the vestibule. But it was the sheriff's sister who struck deepest, cornering Malone by the hymn books. "A man who won't speak his past is hiding something," she purred, adjusting her fox fur collar. "Then again, I suppose beggars can't be choosers." Malone's fingers curled around a pewter candlestick. Before she could retort, a shadow fell across them, Beau holding Ellie's recovered mitten, his silence louder than any threat. The woman scurried away like a startled hen. That night, Malone found Ellie's newest drawing pinned to the icebox, a detailed sketch of the Clayton mine entrance with dates and measurements scrawled in Beau's precise hand. Underneath, in Clara's looping script, proof. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the distant ring of metal on stone. Malone poured 2 whiskeys instead of coffee. When Beau came in from the cold, his knuckles were split open, his boots caked with clay from the mine. He took the glass without a word. Outside, the first thaw of spring cracked through the ice like a long-held secret, finally breaking free. Malone kneaded the dough like it owed her money, her knuckles white with the force of it. The sheriff's words still crawled under her skin, respectable, as if respect came from rings and papers, instead of showing up with coal when the wind cut like a knife. That night she found Clara sitting cross-legged by the window, carving something into the sill with her fingernail. "He'll be back," the girl said without turning. "He ain't the leaving kind." Malone didn't ask how her 12-year-old knew that kind of truth. 2 days later, Beau returned with a deer slung over his shoulders, its blood staining the snow in dark blossoms. He field-dressed it by the woodpile with quick, efficient strokes, not wasting a single tendon. When Malone brought him a basin of hot water, she noticed the fresh bruise along his jawline. "Sheriff's boys?" she asked quietly. He rinsed his hands, the water turning pink. "They suggested I might find warmer company further south." The way he said it, calm as a man discussing the weather, made something hot and fierce rise in Malone's chest. That evening she served venison stew with the last of the molasses biscuits. Ellie slid another drawing across the table, a detailed map of the canyon behind their land, with a bold X near a cluster of pines. Beau studied it, then met Malone's eyes. "Spring's coming. Ground'll thaw soon." She knew what he wasn't saying. The Clayton mine wasn't just about quartz. It was about proof, about burying the sheriff's family secrets deeper than they'd buried her husband. The next Sunday, Reverend Pike preached on the evils of unnatural arrangements. Malone kept her chin high, but Clara's hand trembled in hers. After the service, the butcher's wife accidentally knocked Ellie into the mud. Before Malone could react, Bo was there lifting the girl with one hand and staring down the woman until she retreated like a kicked dog. The townsfolk's whispers grew teeth. That night, Malone found Bo sharpening his skinning knife by firelight. "You don't have to stay for this fight," she said. He tested the blade against his thumb. "Ain't your fight, it's mine." Outside the first spring, peepers began their chorus, a sound like tiny bells ringing underground. Malone poured 2 fingers of whiskey and pushed one toward him. "Then we'd better get our stories straight." When the knock came at dawn, it wasn't the sheriff. 3 miners stood on her porch, their hats in their hands. "Heard you found the East Vein," their leader said, eyes darting to Bo. "We got pics, and long memories about how Clayton really collapsed." Behind them, the rising sun painted the canyon walls in gold, the same color as raw quartz. Malone glanced at Bo, who gave the slightest nod. Somewhere in the house, Ellie laughed for the first time in months. The sound was sweeter than revenge. Malone walked through town like she was wearing armor, her chin high, as women clutched their skirts to avoid brushing against her. The mercantile owner turned the "closed" sign just as she reached for the door. Bo saw it all from across the street, his hands tightening around the sack of grain he'd traded for at the next town over 3 days' ride, just to spare her the shame. That night he oiled her boots until the leather shone, his calloused fingers tracing every crack. "You don't have to do this," Malone said, watching his bent head. Bo kept working. "A man's worth is measured by what he fixes, not what he breaks." The next Sunday, Reverend Pike's sermon burned hotter than hellfire. "When women forsake decency, the whole town suffers." Malone sat stiff-backed in the empty pew, Clara gripping her hand like an anchor. Then the church doors creaked open. Bo stood framed in sunlight, his good shirt buttoned wrong, the 3-legged dog at his heels. He walked straight down the aisle and sat beside Malone, his shoulder brushing hers. The congregation's gasps sounded like a dying wind. That afternoon, Ellie disappeared. Malone found her sketchbook open to a page torn from the family Bible, the prodigal son parable, with the sheriff's face crudely drawn over the father's. The sheriff's men arrived at dusk, their horses kicking up dust. "Your girl's been spreading lies," Deputy Collins spat, waving the torn page. Malone reached for her husband's old rifle above the door. Before she could lift it, Bo stepped out from the barn, his axe balanced easy over one shoulder. "You lost?" he asked, voice mild as milk. The deputies shifted in their saddles. "This ain't your concern, Drifter." Bo hefted the axe. "Funny. I just buried my last concern out back. Want to see?" The men left. That night, Malone sat on the porch, swing its ropes groaning under the weight of everything unsaid. Bo emerged from the shadows holding Ellie's favorite blue ribbon, the one she'd tied around the dog's neck months ago. "Found it near the schoolhouse," he said. "She's building something out there." Malone's breath caught. The schoolhouse stood on what used to be Clayton land. At dawn, they found Ellie kneeling in the dirt behind the abandoned building, her hands black with charcoal as she outlined massive letters across the weathered planks they knew. Around her, a dozen quartz chunks glittered like evidence. Malone dropped to her knees beside her daughter. Bo studied the skyline where the mine's skeletal headframe still stood. "Storm's coming," he murmured. But when Malone looked, the horizon was clear. The next morning, the sheriff himself rode out his badge polished to a cruel shine. He took one look at the schoolhouse wall and laughed. "You really think scribbles will change anything?" Malone stepped forward, her voice quiet as a cocked hammer. "No, But the miners' union telegram to Cheyenne might. For the first time, Holloway's smile faltered. Bo leaned against the porch post, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The dog growled low in its throat. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, or maybe it was dynamite cracking open the earth's secrets at last. Malone woke to the sound of splintering wood. Before dawn's first light, she found Bo in the yard, his axe biting deep into the old oak stump, the one her husband had promised to split before the mine collapse. Each swing landed with surgical precision, his bare back glistening despite the morning chill. Clara stood framed in the doorway, clutching Ellie's latest drawing, a crude courtroom, with stick-figure townspeople pointing at a woman whose dress bled charcoal tears. The sheriff came at high noon, flanked by 2 deputies and Reverend Pike. "Council's called a meeting," he announced, spitting tobacco near Malone's boots. "Seems folks are concerned about moral decay." Behind her, Bo's whetstone hissed against the axe blade in one long, unbroken stroke. Malone didn't turn around. "Tell your counsel I'll be there," she said, "with my account books." The sheriff's smile faltered. Everyone knew about the ledgers Malone's husband had kept mining quotas safety reports all in his meticulous engineer's hand. That night the town hall buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Mrs. Pritchard clutched her hymnal like a shield. "It's unnatural, that man living there without..." "Without what?" Malone's voice cut through the murmurs. She unrolled the ledgers across the council table, their pages yellowed with age and coal dust. "Without permission, like how your husband approved faulty beams to meet quota." The room went still. Reverend Pike reached for the papers, but Bo stepped forward, his shadow swallowing the lantern light. "Careful, preacher," he murmured. "Truth burns." Outside, a child's voice rang clear as a bell. Ellie stood on the hall steps, her small hands unfurling a banner made from stitched-together drawings. The mine collapse, the sheriff's secret meetings, Bo repairing every broken thing in Malone's life. The townspeople leaned in their whispers, turning sharp as broken glass. Sheriff Holloway lunged for the banner. Bo moved faster, catching his wrist with a grip that cracked like gunshot. "Touch that girl," he said very quietly, "and I'll show you what unnatural really looks like." The meeting dissolved after that. Malone walked home with Bo at her left and Clara at her right, Ellie's tiny hand clutching her skirt. Behind them, the 3-legged dog kept watch, its growl low and constant. That night, Malone didn't bother closing the curtains when Bo stoked the fire. Let them look. Let them see the way he cradled Ellie's sleeping form when she crawled into his lap, or how Clara trusted him to braid her hair just so. The axe leaned against the doorframe, its edge gleaming in the firelight, not a weapon, but a promise. Somewhere in the darkness, a new rumor began taking root. They said Clayton's ghost walked again. They said he carried an axe and a little girl's drawings. They said justice, when it finally came, would wear the face of a quiet man who knew how to fix broken things. Malone found the carving at dawn, the single letter M etched deep into the table's grain, right where Bo always set his coffee cup. Her thumb traced the groove as Clara padded in sleep, still clinging to her lashes. "He marked his place," the girl murmured, pressing her small hand over her mother's. Outside, the first true storm of spring gathered over the mountains, the air thick with the scent of thawing earth and pine resin. Bo appeared at midday with an armful of wild currant branches, their buds tight-fisted against the cold. "For the girls," he said, arranging them in a cracked milk jug on the windowsill. "They'll bloom indoors first." Ellie clapped her hands, silent, but her joy rang louder than church bells. That's when Malone noticed the fresh cuts on Bo's forearms. She reached for him without thinking, her fingers brushing the briar scratches. "You went to Clayton Ridge." "The only place currants grew wild. the place where the mine shaft had swallowed her husband. Bo didn't pull away. "Found something else there." From his pocket, he withdrew a brass button stamped with a mining company logo, the same kind she'd sewn onto her husband's coat the week before the collapse. The wind kicked up suddenly, howling through the canyon like a wounded thing. Malone's knees buckled. Bo caught her elbow steady as the fence posts he'd set. That evening, Sheriff Holloway rode up with a court summons flapping in his grip. "Council voted," he sneered. "Either that drifter leaves by sundown tomorrow, or we take the matter to Judge Henley." Malone didn't blink. "Tell Henley to bring his spectacles. He'll need them to read my husband's ledgers." The sheriff's horse shied as if spooked. "Those papers burned in the office fire." Malone smiled coldly. "Funny how some things survive." She turned to where Bo stood in the doorway, his axe balanced easy across his shoulders. The sheriff left without another word, but the threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. That night, Malone sat on the porch swing, with Bo's coat draped over her shoulders, the one she'd mended 3 times now. The dog whined softly as distant hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Not retreating, circling. Clara appeared in the doorway, her hair braided tight for battle. "They're coming back," she said, not a question. Bo tested the axe edge with his thumb. "Let them." Malone rose the carved M, burning like a brand against her palm. She reached for the rifle above the door, then stopped. Instead, she took Ellie's latest drawing from the wall, a detailed map of the Clayton mine shafts, with a red X marking the collapse site, and folded it into Bo's hand. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "We dig." The wind shifted, then carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of currant buds beginning to burst. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rumbled, or maybe it was the sound of the past finally cracking open. The carved wooden horse took shape under Bo's knife. As the moon rose, a rough-hewn thing with a wild mane, one hoof lifted mid-gallop. Malone watched the curls of wood fall like snowflakes between his boots. "That for Ellie?" she asked. Bo ran his thumb along the horse's spine. "Figured she ought to have something that can't be taken away." The words hung between them heavier than the sheriff's threats. At first light, Malone found the sheriff's warning nailed to her barn door, a crude drawing of a hangman's noose, the rope coiled like a rattlesnake. She tore it down just as Clara emerged, her eyes old beyond her years. "They won't stop," the girl said, not a question. Malone pressed the crumpled paper into her apron pocket. "Then neither will we." The boycott hit hard. The mercantile refused her eggs. The blacksmith forgot to sharpen her tools. But it was the schoolmarm turning Ellie away that finally broke Malone's silence. She marched into the one-room schoolhouse with Bo's axe in hand and nailed Ellie's drawings over the alphabet charts, every damning sketch of the mine collapse, the sheriff's secrets, the truth spelled out in charcoal and child's hand. "You want to teach?" Malone challenged the trembling teacher. "Then teach this." That night, the town's wrath came calling. Torches flickered at the edge of Malone's property as a dozen men emerged from the dark Holloway at their center, his badge polished to a cruel shine. "Last chance, widow. Send him packing." The cabin door creaked open. Bo stepped out alone, the wooden horse clutched in one hand, his axe in the other. Then Malone appeared beside him. Clara at her right, gripping a rusted mining pick, Ellie at her left with a kitchen knife. The 3-legged dog bared its teeth. For a heartbeat, the mob hesitated. Then a rock flew shattering the window behind them. Malone didn't flinch. She raised her voice like she was calling cattle home. "You boys ever wonder why the Clayton mine really collapsed, or why Holloway's uncle bought up all the claims afterward?" The sheriff's face went slack. That's when the miners arrived, 20 strong, their lanterns cutting through the dark like a second dawn. Old Man Pritchard stepped forward, his voice gravel and grief. "We wondered plenty, ma'am. Reckon it's time we heard the truth." The torchlight flickered across Beau's face as he reached into his coat. Not for a weapon, but for a yellowed ledger page. Malone's husband's last entry dated the day he died. "Beams 3 and 4 compromised," told Holloway. He said, "Keep digging." The sheriff drew his revolver. The dog lunged. And somewhere in the chaos, Ellie's wooden horse fell to the dirt, its carved hoof finally touching ground. The quilt stretched between them like a battlefield map, each patch a story Malone had buried years ago. Beau's calloused fingers moved carefully over the frayed edges, his stitches uneven, but strong. Clara crept in with a candle, her shadow dancing across the fabric, as she added her own square a scrap from her childhood pinafore, stitched with clumsy, determined thread. Ellie pressed close, her silent fingers tracing the patterns, until Malone guided her hand with the needle. "Like this, darlin'," she murmured. "Small bites, so the fabric don't fight back." At dawn, the sheriff's men rode up to serve the eviction notice. They found the cabin door wide open, the quilt hanging bold as a flag from the porch rafters, its new patches gleaming bright against the worn fabric. Malone stood beneath it with Beau's axe in one hand and a steaming pot of coffee in the other. "Boys," she called, her voice carrying across the frostbit yard, "you gonna stand there gawking or you coming in for breakfast?" The men hesitated. Then Old Man Pritchard dismounted, his knees cracking as he approached. "That's my wife's calico," he said, pointing to a sunflower yellow patch. Malone nodded. "Found it in the church donation box. Figured it deserved better than gathering dust." One by one, the miners followed, some to stare at the quilt, others to accept the coffee Malone poured with steady hands. The sheriff's deputy lingered at the edge, his eyes darting to where Beau stood sharpening knives by the hearth. "Heard you been digging up at Clayton," the deputy muttered. Beau tested a blade with his thumb. "Heard you been taking Holloway's bribes." The cabin fell silent. Malone set down the coffee pot with a thud. "Anybody else got bones to pick?" she challenged. That's when Ellie tugged the deputy's sleeve, holding up her wooden horse, its mane now braided with threads from the quilt, its back bearing a tiny scrap of blue ribbon. The deputy's hard expression flickered. He reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a folded wanted poster, the sheriff's face staring back, the words, "Mine fraud," stamped beneath in bold ink. "Judge Henley issued this yesterday," he said quietly. "Holloway's on the run." Malone exhaled slowly, her breath curling in the cold air. She turned to Beau, who was already looking at her, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something that might have been hope. Outside, the first true sunrise of spring broke over the mountains, painting the quilt in gold. The stitches held. Malone rose from the pew like a storm gathering strength. The quilted shawl around her shoulders, the one stitched with scraps of their survival, slid to the floor as she turned to face the congregation. The sheriff's smirk faltered when she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her husband's brass mining tag, its number still legible beneath the grime. "Preacher," she said, her voice carrying like a rifle shot in the stunned silence. "You remember reading over 6 bodies at Clayton Mine?" She let the tag dangle from its broken chain. "My man was one. Now tell me what chapter in that pretty Bible says it's decent to hound his widow for letting an honest man chop her firewood." A chair scraped near the back. Old Man Pritchard stood, his gnarled hands gripping the pew. "She's right." His voice shook with something hotter than shame. "We buried good men in that collapse. Holloway's been lining his pockets ever since." The sheriff lunged forward, but Beau was already moving not toward him, but to the pulpit. He laid Ellie's latest drawing on the lectern, a detailed sketch of the mine's support beams, the words, "Safety inspection overdue," clearly visible on a clipboard in the corner. The preacher's face went pale. That's when Clara stepped into the aisle, her Sunday dress patched at the elbows, her chin high. She unwrapped the loaf of bread Malone had baked, the one with the red ribbon, and tore it cleanly in half. "Anybody hungry?" she asked, holding it out like an offering. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then Pritchard's granddaughter darted forward, grabbing a piece with both hands. The dam broke. Miners' families surged toward Clara, their fingers brushing hers as they took the bread, some hesitantly, others with tears in their eyes. The sheriff stood frozen, his authority crumbling like rotten mine timbers. Malone didn't smile. She simply picked up her quilt, shook out the dust, and draped it over Beau's shoulders as they walked back down the aisle. Outside, the first crocuses of spring pushed through the frozen churchyard dirt, tiny and stubborn, and impossible to stop. That evening, Malone found the sheriff's eviction notice nailed to her barn door again. This time someone had crossed out the words and written beneath them in bold charcoal letters, "We stay." She left it there, letting the wind rattle it like a flag. Inside, Beau stoked the fire, while Ellie arranged her wooden horses along the quilt's edge, each one facing east toward the rising sun. Malone woke to the sound of hammering at first light. She found Beau in the yard, rebuilding the porch swing with fresh cedar, the sweet scent of cut wood mixing with the morning frost. Clara knelt beside him, holding nails between her teeth, like she'd seen him do, while Ellie arranged her wooden horses along the new seat boards. Malone leaned in the doorway, watching as Beau guided Clara's small hands to drive the first nail straight. By noon, half the town had seen the sheriff's resignation letter nailed to the post office door, his badge pinned beneath it with a miner's pick. Old Man Pritchard spat tobacco near the steps and muttered, "Took long enough." The mercantile owner sent over a sack of flour with no bill attached. That evening, Malone set the table with her wedding china, the cracked plates she'd kept wrapped in newspaper for a decade. Beau paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "You sure?" he asked, eyeing the delicate porcelain. Malone placed the last plate with a clink. "Some things," she said, "are worth mending." As they sat down to eat, Beau, Malone, and the girls all crowded around the too small table. The three-legged dog let out a single, sharp bark. Outside, a line of townsfolk stood at the edge of the property, their arms laden with offerings, jars of preserves, a new milk pail, a bolt of calico bright as spring wildflowers. At the front stood the preacher holding a Bible and a hammer. Malone met them at the fence. The preacher cleared his throat. "We came to help rebuild." His eyes darted to where Beau stood silhouetted in the cabin doorway. "If you'll have us." Clara squeezed her mother's hand. Malone looked back at the table at Ellie's drawing, now pinned to the wall at the wedding china, glowing in the lamplight at the empty chair that wasn't empty anymore. She unhooked the gate. "Bring your own nails," she said, and turned toward home. Behind her, the first stars of evening blinked awake above the canyon, their light catching on the new swing's freshly oiled ropes. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, not a warning this time, but a song as old as the hills, the kind that only plays when the lost have finally found their way.